What is up, everybody? My name is Pauper Player, and today we are going to be opening up Gruul Cascade, a red-green deck that basically just plays big creatures and some land destruction and some lightning bolts to just kind of outvalue your opponent. If you're interested in this deck, the list will be down in the description below, and while you're down there, press the subscribe button. It really helps support the channel. We've opened up a ton of decks in the past that you could check out in the playlist down below, and in the next few weeks, maybe in like a month's time or so, we're going to start playing Pauper in paper here in this room with my friend. I already have the black table back there, and I got some chairs, and I have some extra cameras and microphones coming in, so just stay tuned for that. While you're down in the comments telling me what you think about this deck and what other decks I should open, also let me know what matches you're excited to see. Like, what decks do you want to see go up against one another during the paper Pauper playing? As per usual, we'll be sleeving our cards in our Dragon Shield matte sleeves and keeping our cards in our Ultimate Guard Boulder deck box. Packing peanuts! Alright, this deck I'm excited for. I wanted to order this deck such a long time ago, but damn, Utopia Sprawls are always so expensive that I've been holding off on it. Untap, upkeep, board wipe. Okay, honestly, the sticker's pretty cool, but I hate the cardkingdom.com at the bottom. I might like cut that off because the sticker itself is kind of sick. Actually, low-key, that's going on my laptop. So let's go ahead and kick this off with our two main creatures, starting off with Annoyed Altasar, which is a 6/5 creature with reach and trample that costs 7 mana, 2 green and 5 colorless, and it has Cascade. His ass looks weird. Is that just me? We're running 3 copies of Annoyed Altasar, and then we're running 4 copies of our other main creature, Boarding Party, which also has Cascade, but it's a 6/3 creature with haste, and it costs 6 mana, a red and 5 colorless. So before we get into talking about how Cascade works, let's just go over some of the other keywords real quick. First off, Annoyed Altasar has reach, which means that he's able to block creatures with flying. Annoyed Altasar also has trample, which means that if he's blocked by a smaller creature, any access damage that's done to that creature still goes to the player. Now, in Magic, when you play a creature, they're not able to attack on the turn they come out because of something called Summoning Sickness. Boarding Party has haste, meaning that it's able to attack the turn that you play it. So let's go ahead and get into how Cascade works. Now, when Cascade goes off, you exile the top cards of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less than the card with Cascade on it. So for example, Annoyed Altasar is 7 mana. So when you Cascade with Annoyed Altasar, you exile top cards of your library until you hit a card that costs less than 7 mana. What this also means is when you're exiling cards from top of your library, if you happen to hit another Annoyed Altasar, you're not able to Cascade into it because these two have the same converted mana cost. Now, when you do exile a non-land card from top of your library with Cascade, and it is something that costs less than Annoyed Altasar, you now have the option to cast this card without paying its mana cost. This verbiage is important because your opponent has the opportunity to counterspell the card that you Cascade into. So now let's go ahead and talk about the cards that you exile that you're not able to cast. For example, like I said, cards that cost equal to or more than the card that you're cascading with. As previously mentioned, Annoyed Altasar can't cascade into himself, so this card will go into exile. Your next card is a land. You can't cascade into lands, and then you finally hit a card that you can play. After you cast and resolve the card you cascade into, the other cards you exiled will go in the bottom of your library. Now, the awesome wombo combo with this deck is because Annoyed Altasar is 7 mana, when you play Annoyed Altasar and you cascade, if you cascade into Boarding Party, you can cast Boarding Party because Boarding Party is only 6 mana. And because you're still casting Boarding Party, you get to now use Boarding Party's Cascade for cards that are 5 mana or less. This is what makes this combo so lethal because you only spent 7 mana to play Annoyed Altasar. You got to play Boarding Party for free, which is a 6/3 with haste, so now you just get to attack for 6 damage on this turn that it came out on. You got to cascade again. You get to find something like Avenging Hunter, so now you get to take the initiative, and now you will have a 5/4 with trample on the field, you have a 6/3 with haste on the field, and you have a 6/5 with reach and trample on the field, and you just got like insane value for only 7 mana. The downside with Cascade is because it's a cast trigger, when Cascade goes off and you reveal cards from top of your library, your opponent can choose what they may want to counter depending on what you cascade into. If you play Annoyed Altasar and you cascade into something like Arbor Elf, it kind of sucks because Arbor Elf doesn't really do anything at this point in the game. So in response to you casting Arbor Elf, your opponent can counterspell the Annoyed Altasar because this is still on the stack as a cast because the Cascade is going off. In contrast, if you cascade into something with more value like Avenging Hunter, your opponent's more likely going to counter that instead, So that'll counter your Avenging Hunter, and then your Annoyed Altasar will resolve and go onto the battlefield. This gets really messy if you do Cascade into Boarding Party, because your opponent can counter Boarding Party, but now Boarding Party's Cascade will still go off, so that Cascade trigger will go. Avenging Hunter will now go on the stack, and now your opponent basically has 3 targets to counter. In this scenario, they will still just counter Avenging Hunter, and then these 2 will then resolve. But if you Cascade with Boarding Party and hit something like Arbor Elf, something your opponent doesn't care about, they can still counter the Annoyed Altasar, because all these cast triggers are still resolving. Nothing has hit the board yet. Your opponent can cast Counterspell, countering Annoyed Altasar. Annoyed Altasar will leave the stack, and then Arbor Elf will enter the battlefield, and then Boarding Party will enter the battlefield. Luckily for you, Boarding Party still has haste, so you can still attack them for 6 damage, but I digress. So as I previously mentioned, we're running 3 copies of Annoyed Altasar and 4 copies of Boarding Party, and now we're going to get into our 4 copies of Avenging Hunter, which is a 5/4 creature with trample that costs 5 mana, a green and 4 colorless, that when it enters a battlefield, you take the initiative. So let's go ahead and talk about how the initiative works. And I'm sorry this is a foil if that bothers you. This was the only copy they had. So the initiative is a board state mechanic that you or your opponent can activate at any time, as long as one of you plays a card that says you take the initiative. Now, once the initiative is actually on the field, both you and your opponent can steal the initiative from one another by the other person either playing another card that says you take the initiative or through combat damage. So on our turn, we play Avenging Hunter and we get the initiative, and then our opponent attacks us on their following turn. Now they get the initiative. Now our turn comes up and we attack back. We have trample, so even if they block, we still do damage to that player. So we take the initiative back, and this goes back and forth infinitely. So now let's get into what actually happens when you take the initiative. Now there's a total of 4 dungeons in Magic the Gathering, but the Undercity can only be entered with the initiative mechanic. Now when you first take the initiative, you automatically go into the first room of the dungeon here called Secret Entrance that says search your library for a basic land card, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. Let's just assume that your opponent is unable to take the initiative and you have the initiative like indefinitely. Now when you actively have the initiative, on your next turn on your upkeep, you take the initiative again, allowing you to go into the next room of the Undercity. You can choose to either go to Forge, which puts 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature, or you can go to Lost Well, which allows you to scry 2. So you just took the initiative on your upkeep, and let's say you play a second Avenging Hunter. Avenging Hunter enters the battlefield, you take the initiative again. So now you can go into another room, being either Trap, being target player loses 5 life, or Arena, go target creature, which means you force a creature to block. Now after finally taking the initiative enough times, either through your upkeeps or by playing more than one Avenging Hunter, you then have completed the dungeon and now have left the Undercity. Now when you've completed the Undercity and you play another Avenging Hunter, or maybe you already have the initiative and it goes to your next turn's upkeep, so you take the initiative again, you will re-enter the Undercity and start all over again. Now let's actually get the opponent involved. We play Avenging Hunter, we take the initiative, and we start up the Undercity in the Secret Entrance. Now on our opponent's turn, they have a flying creature and they attack into it. So now they take the initiative and they will now enter the Undercity themselves. The rules for the Undercity that apply to you also apply to your opponent. It's just a matter of who actually has the initiative. This is another reason why Annoyed Altasar is really important in this deck, because both Annoyed Altasar and Avenging Hunter have trample, meaning that even if your opponent blocks, you'll still be able to do combat damage to your opponent through the trample damage, meaning you'll be able to take the initiative back that way. Additionally, Annoyed Altasar and Avenging Hunter are really hard to block, they're really easy to block with, and Annoyed Altasar also has reach, meaning that your opponent can't keep sneaking the initiative away from you with flying creatures. As you may have noticed, all 3 of those cards are pretty expensive when it comes to their mana cost, right? 7 mana for Annoyed Altasar is a lot, Avenging Hunter's 5 mana, so you don't really get them out very early on, unless you have a really strong ramp package. So we're going to start off our ramp package with one of the most iconic ramp combos in all of Magic history: 4 copies of Arbor Elf and 4 copies of Utopia Sprawl. On your first turn, you play a forest and you play an Arbor Elf, which is a 1/1 creature for 1 green mana that says when you tap it, you can untap target forest. Now, unfortunately, because of summoning sickness, like we talked about earlier, because Arbor Elf just entered the battlefield, you cannot tap it for its ability, so you can't untap your forest on turn 1. That would be broken. But what you can do is on your second turn, you can untap, upkeep, draw, play your second land for turn, which does need to be another forest. You tap that forest for a green mana, and you enchant your other forest with Utopia Sprawl. Utopia Sprawl is a 1 green mana enchant enchantment aura that says enchant forest. As Utopia Sprawl comes into play, choose a color, and whenever enchanted forest is tapped for mana, its controller adds 1 mana of the chosen color to his or her mana pool. So now because this forest has a Utopia Sprawl attached to it, when you tap this forest for 1 green mana, you will also get 1 color mana of whatever color you chose. And because it's your second turn, your Arbor Elf no longer has Summoning Sickness. So now what you can do is you can tap your Arbor Elf to untap target forest, allowing you to then tap it again for an additional 2 mana. This is how you create 4 mana on turn 2. And 4 mana on turn 2 allows you to cast cards like Moonvoli Acid Moss, which is a 4 mana sorcery, 2 green and 2 colorless that says destroy target land, search your library for a forest card, and put that card into play tapped, then shuffle your library. Are you starting to catch why this is getting out of control quickly? So on turn 2, you have 4 mana available. You play Moonvoli Acid Moss, you get to grab a land from your library and put it onto the battlefield, and now on your third turn, when you play another land, you now have 6 mana. So on turn 3, you can cast your Boarding Party, which can then cascade into your Avenging Hunter, which allows you to get another basic land, and you basically just pop off and win the game from that point, honestly. We're also running 2 copies of Wild Growth, which is another 1 green mana enchantment that says enchant land. Whenever enchant land is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional green mana. Utopia Sprawl specifically says enchant forest, meaning you can't enchant any of your basic mountains, but what you can enchant is one of our 2 copies of Highland Forest. The reason being is because Highland Forest has the subtype forest in it. I don't have the green artifact land on me, so I'm going to use Mistvault Bridge as an example. Notice how Mistvault Bridge doesn't have Swamp Island written on it because it doesn't have that subtype. It's just an artifact land, but Highland Forest is a snowland, but it's also a mountain forest, so you can enchant a target forest. In contrast, Wild Growth says enchant any land, so if for some reason you had a Mistvault Bridge in like a green, black, blue deck, this land is not in this deck. Mistvault Bridge you can enchant with Wild Growth because it just says enchant land, so when you tap Mistvault Bridge, you can tap it for either a blue or a black, and then also a green. The 2 copies of Wild Growth are basically in this deck just so that we can also enchant our mountains if we need to. Okay, that was a lot of cards at once. Let's just go over them one more time. We have the 4 copies of Arbor Elf, 4 copies of Utopia Sprawl, 2 copies of Wild Growth, and then 4 copies of Moonvoli Acid Moss. I had somebody in my YouTube comments a couple days ago tell me that they hate the way I pronounce some Magic cards, and this is probably not going to help that case. And because we already talked about the lands, we don't have a complex mana base in this deck. We have the 2 copies of Highland Forest, we have 2 basic mountains, and then we have 15 basic forests because again, you want to make sure that on turn 2, you're able to do your Utopia Sprawl Arbor Elf combo, so having 2 basic forests in your starting hand is pretty important. Okay, so the rest of the deck will be easy to talk about, I promise. Next up, we have 4 copies of Jewel Thief, which is a 3/3 creature with Vigilance and Trample that costs 3 mana, green and 2 colorless, that when it enters a battlefield, create a treasure token. So Jewel Thief is kind of a ramp card because treasure tokens can tap and be sacrificed to add 1 color of any mana to your mana pool. When you attack with creatures in Magic, you're supposed to tap them to indicate that they're attacking, but this also means that they can't block when your opponent attacks on their turn, but Vigilance means you don't tap your creature when you attack with it. So you can attack with your Jewel Thief, deal 3 damage, and then when your opponent attacks on their turn, you can still block with Jewel Thief because it's untapped. So we're running 4 copies of Jewel Thief and 4 copies of Stone Rain, which is a 3 mana sorcery, a red and 2 colorless, destroy target land. So that's the thing about this deck, is that it's called Gruul Cascade, but it's also known as Gruul Land Destruction because it's playing the 4 mosses, the 4 Stone Rains, and then 1 copy of Thermocast, which is another 3 mana sorcery, but this time 2 green and 1 colorless, destroy target land. If that land is a snow-covered land, you gain 1 life. Technically speaking, most decks run 4 Thermocast and 1 Stone Rain, but it doesn't matter because they're pretty much the same exact card. Snow-covered lands are not that big of a deal in Pauper, and Thermocast are hard to find, and they're also like $3 a piece, while Stone Rain is only 50 cents, so I'm running 4 Stone Rain and 1 Thermocast, bite me. And as per usual, and as expected, Mercadian Mask has the superior art for Stone Rain. That's just my opinion, but my opinion is also fact. So next up, we have 3 copies of Serulf's Packmate, which is a 3/3 creature that costs 4 mana, a green and 3 colorless, that when it enters a battlefield, you get to draw a card. It also has Foretell for 2. So during your turn, you may pay 2 mana and exile this card from your hand face down, cast it on a later turn for its Foretell cost. Typically speaking, in Magic, you want to play cards of the converted mana cost of the turn that you're on, so you would play Serulf's Packmate Pac-Mate on turn 4. But what you can also do is if you have Pac-Mate in your hand on your second turn and you have no other cards to play, you might as well spend the 2 mana to just exile it face down. That way on your third turn, you can pay the foretell cost to flip it, and then you still have 1 mana up, and then on your fourth turn, you could play a different card instead of spending the 4 mana to play Pac-Mate instead. It's a pretty decent card to cascade into, but again, early on in the game, if you don't really have a whole lot going on, you can just play this for its foretell cost and hopefully just get a little value out of it. And then finally, we have 4 copies of Lightning Ball, a 1 red mana instant that deals 3 damage to target creature or player. Okay, let's go ahead and get into the sideboard, starting off with 3 copies of Fiery Cannonade, which is a 3 mana instant, a red and 2 colorless. Fiery Cannonade deals 2 damage to each non-pirate creature. Next up, we got 4 copies of Weather the Storm, which is a 2 mana instant, a green and a colorless. You gain 3 life, and then it has Storm, which means when you cast a spell, copy it for each spell cast before it this turn. So Weather the Storm would usually gain you 3 life, but if your opponent's played a couple cards because they're playing a combo deck of some sort and they've casted like 4 spells for the turn, when you cast Weather the Storm, you'll be able to gain 15 life. 4 times for the 4 spells they casted, and then the 1 Weather the Storm that you're casting now, which will equate to 15 life. Extremely good against burn decks that are trying to activate their own prowess triggers. You can just Weather the Storm and basically negate all the damage that they do. Next up, we have 4 copies of Deglamour, which is a 2 mana instant, a green and a colorless. Choose target artifact or enchantment. Its owner shuffles it into his or her library. This card's really good in dealing with Affinity and Boggles. Affinity specifically because you can't destroy their indestructible artifact lands, but you can put them back into your opponent's library, which can severely hinder them if those lands are 3/3 creatures with flying. Next up is another card to shit on artifact decks, which is Gorilla Shaman, a 1/1 creature that costs 1 red mana, and then for 1 colorless mana and 2x, destroy target non-creature artifact with mana value X. So excluding the 1 extra mana here, what the double X means is that if you're trying to destroy your opponent's artifact that costs 1 mana, you have to pay 2 mana in order to do that. The easiest way to explain this is take the mana cost of whatever artifact you want to destroy, double that, and then add 1, and that's the mana that you have to pay in order to activate this ability. So if you're trying to blow up your opponent's Mirror Enforcer, you have 7 times 2, which is 14, and then plus 1, so it will cost 15 mana to blow up your opponent's Mirror Enforcer, which is not great value, but what is great value is that lands in Magic have a converted mana cost of 0. So if you were to target your opponent's artifact land, 0 times 2 is still 0, plus 1 equals 1. So basically, you could pay 1 red mana, play Gorilla Shaman, and then on your following turn, you can pay 3 mana and blow up 3 of your opponent's artifact lands, which is just... But just know that this ability doesn't work on the artifact dual lands because they're indestructible and you can't destroy indestructible lands like that. And then finally, we have 2 copies of Relic of Pergenesis, which is a 1 mana artifact. You can tap it to make a target player exile a card from his or her graveyard, or you could pay 1 mana to exile Relic of Pergenesis and exile all cards from all graveyards and draw a card. There isn't much to say about this card. This deck does 0 interaction with its own graveyard, so this card is really good at dealing with other opponents' graveyards. So that is going to be Gruul Cascade for Pauper. This deck is fantastic. I've been wanting to play it for quite some time now. I love land destruction because I'm a horrible person, and if you do play Modern, this is like the closest Pauper deck that comes to like Jund. So I would highly recommend playing this deck if you're into mid-range green-red decks. Like I mentioned before, the list will be down in description below, and please press subscribe button. It helps motivate me to make more videos for the channel. And like I said, we're gonna be doing like actual Paper Pauper gameplay soon, and I'm really excited for that, and you don't want to miss out. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.